Hello, everyone. Thanks for coming. Very excited. If you don't know, I'm Tyron Hyde from Washington Brown. I'm the CEO of Washington Brown. Look, normally at this time of year, I give a talk on how much tax depreciation you should claim or what depreciation report you should have. But, it's not all about selling to you guys. It's about adding value. So this year, especially after the recent turn of events being, if I can change this slide, being the fact that the election is over and negative gearing doesn't seem to be changing much or at all. APRA has seemed to have loosened the belts for banks, and interest rates the other day by the RBA has come down. I started thinking, where should I buy? Where should I buy property? And I thought I'd phone a friend. And the friend I phoned was Terry Ryder. He's the founder and managing director of hotspotting.com.au. It's a good friend of mine, and I'll give you a bit of his bio. He was a property editor for the Courier Mail in Brisbane. He started a company and owner-operator of Ryder Property Consulting. He's the founder and director of hotspotting.com.au. He's still a columnist for the Australian and Property Observer. So over the years, I've travelled with Terry. I've listened to him speak, and I've always been very attentive to what he said. I like his independence, and I think you will too. So Terry's going to give a talk now about where you should buy. If you have any questions about where you should buy or any questions at all, put them into the chat box, and we hopefully will at the end have a chance to answer, or Terry will have a chance to answer those questions. So Terry, how are you?
I'm good, Tyron. I'm very good, and I'm very pleased to be here talking about my favourite subject with you tonight. I'm always happy to talk about real estate. The trick is getting me to shut up, actually. So I'm going to try very hard, to get everything that I need to say that I think might be useful to the audience, nicely fitted into, say, about 45 minutes, allowing a bit of time at the end for some questions. So I'm just going to...
I've just changed the slides over to you. Look, we did this talk at lunchtime today, and I was incredibly informed, so I hope you guys are too. So
Tyron, just tell me, can you see my screen at this moment?
I can see it. I can see it. I think you need to go into present mode, perhaps.
Yeah. I just wanted, before I did that, I was just checking that. There we go.
There you are.
Okay.
There you go. Beautiful. Over to you, Terry.
All right. Thanks, Tyron. Welcome everyone who's watching and listening. It's a great time to be having this discussion because, as I'm sure most of you are aware, a lot has changed. What I'm referring to in the headline on the screen is the new post-election real estate landscape. Very much a time of change ahead. We're sitting in the midst of enormous change in property markets, and the trick right now for property investors, in the wake of the decline in the Sydney and Melbourne markets, which had previously been for 4 to 5 years, is where to go for the next growth, how to find the growth markets. But firstly, the background in which it sits. So there's no doubt that sentiment surrounding real estate has changed enormously in the last 2 to 3 weeks. There were a number of breaks on decision making and a number of barriers to real estate investors being active or their willingness to make big decisions. Particularly in the lead up to the federal election. We had kind of a perfect storm of negatives, and within the space of a few weeks, it's turned downside up, as I like to phrase it. So we now have more of a perfect storm of positives impacting on real estate. A federal election is always a huge barrier to people making decisions because it creates uncertainty. They don't know who's going to win, and that was particularly the case because it looked like the Labor Party was going to win and implement their unhelpful policies on capital gains tax and negative gearing. Those two breaks on activity are out of the way, and since the election, in rapid succession, we're seeing APRA making some very helpful changes or announcing changes coming up to make borrowing easier. The interest rate cuts announced by the Reserve Bank, which have been passed on in part or in full by the major lenders, And prior to that, in anticipation of that Reserve Bank decision, lots of lenders had already cut their interest rate. So borrowing is now cheaper as well as easier. There's also help out there for first home buyers, including the scheme announced by the federal government during the election campaign. And probably the biggest single factor, I think, is the turnaround in media sentiment, which was overwhelmingly negative, sensationally so, and unreasonably so in the early part of this year. But since the election and those other things that have happened, like the interest rate reduction and the APRA announcement, we've seen a turnaround in sentiment. So now we have media talking in terms of the Sydney and Melbourne market bottoming out, and prices are no longer falling there, and also starting to acknowledge that there are markets around Australia, as I'm going to point out in this presentation, plenty of growth markets around Australia right now, and plenty of others that have the potential in the near future to become growth markets. It's interesting to look at the price data that gets published by the research houses like Domain and CoreLogic, and published in mainstream media, because they have a very, very simplistic approach. They tend to produce one figure that says Sydney house prices are doing X, or Brisbane apartment prices have dropped by X%. And what we find with the analysis that we do at hotspotting.com.au, when we go in a lot more depth than that, every quarter we do a suburb by suburb, town by town analysis of sales activity and price trends for every significant location across the country. We find there's a lot happening behind those generalized figures. You'll also notice, if you look at the table on the screen, how the various sources seldom agree at how much markets are rising or falling, or even if markets are rising or falling, because some sources think Brisbane's down a little, other sources think they're up a little. Now, we quite commonly have that situation. If you look at the figures for Darwin, there's one source that says Darwin's up a little, another says it's 0% change in the last 12 months, and then there's a few others that have it down a little. And those sorts of differences pop up in the statistics from the different sources. They all have different methodology. In my opinion, it's all dodgy data to a certain degree, and the worst part of it is they generalize about very, very large markets like Melbourne. Melbourne's down 10% or 12%, but when you look behind those figures, you find there's lots of different scenarios playing out across Melbourne. Some markets are down a lot, others are down only a little, and there are parts of the Melbourne market that are still up in terms of prices. So I think it's wise to take those published generalized figures in media with a grain of salt, and to do more substantive research, and that's where hopefully Hotspotting and others like us can help you get real in-depth data and find out what's really going on in markets around Australia. Just to illustrate the point that there is plenty of growth happening in property markets around the country right now. Contrary to that general theme, the general theme in media is that prices are falling everywhere. In fact, you see that stated in media almost every day over the last, say, 4 or 5 months. Simply isn't true. What media tends to have done is taken the Sydney situation, extrapolated it across the country, and created a kind of national downturn crisis, and it simply isn't happening. There's lots of growth markets. I think I'm confident in saying that right now in Australia there are more locations where prices are rising than there are locations where prices are falling. To illustrate that point, some of the figures on the screen. In Adelaide, our suburb by suburb analysis tells us, for example, that 3/4 of the suburbs in Adelaide have median prices higher than 12 months ago. In Brisbane, it's 7 out of 10. In Hobart, it's almost 100%. Even in a market where media keeps telling us is still falling, like Perth, our analysis tells us that 40% of the suburbs of Perth have median prices higher than 12 months ago. But what we do believe at Hotspotting is that the strongest markets in Australia right now are in regional Australia. They're not getting any airplay in major media. We're not hearing about them almost at all, and it's a shame, because investors aren't being told about markets that not only have rising prices and potential for growth, but they're also the most affordable parts of the market, and the parts of the market with the best rental returns, and we're not being told about them. But right now, regional Victoria, 9 out of 10 locations have rising prices. Regional New South Wales, quite a contrast to Sydney, 85% of the locations, the towns across regional New South Wales have got prices higher than 12 months ago. Regional Queensland at 65%. And regional Tasmania, like Hobart, it's almost 100%. So there's lots of growth out there. Switched on investors have been buying in these places. but a lot of people haven't because they're just not being told about them by a misinformed and shallow media. So we're here to try and help you get better information than that. And the big question for investors around the country primarily is, where next? Where can we go for growth now that Sydney and Melbourne are no longer booming and we're being told that prices are falling across the country? Where can we find some growth? And as I've just said, there's lots of places you can go right now, right across Australia, and find growth markets. And the catch phrase that we've come up with to encapsulate what we think is the best advice is think small for big growth. And by that we mean the growth is now being found and will be found in the near future in the smaller capital cities and in some of the regional centres. So think small for big growth. And just to illustrate the point and give you some examples of locations where currently right now there's growth. For the last 2 years, I'd say that Geelong, just outside Melbourne, has been, you could arguably say, the strongest market in Australia. Still strong in terms of price growth. On the screen, top right-hand side of the screen, you can see a couple of examples of suburbs of the city of Greater Geelong and the median price growth they've had in the last 12 months. Still showing growth there. I believe that market's now past its peak, but price growth is still happening in Geelong, including in the last 12 months, 17% in Corio, 19% in Norlane. These are a couple of the more affordable markets in Geelong, and also, coincidentally, a couple of the suburbs that are closest to central Melbourne. So they've had massive demand from first home buyers and others on a budget. Ballarat's another growth market. 4 suburbs, just as examples there: Ballarat North, Winduri, etc., Golden Point, all have had substantial growth in their median prices in the last 12 months. Markets like Ballarat, also Bendigo, and some of the hill change towns a little bit north of Melbourne are getting a lot of demand out of Melbourne, both by home buyers, particularly young ones, and investors looking for a higher level of affordability. People have been priced out of Melbourne following their recent boom phase. Investors looking for cheaper prices and better rental returns. Home buyers looking for a different lifestyle, more affordable prices in places that are perhaps within commuting distance of Melbourne. And Ballarat ticks a lot of boxes in that regard, so does Bendigo. And then if you go further afield, just in the bottom right-hand screen and in blue, some of the smaller centres that have also had very, very good price growth in the last 12 months. Echuca is one of them. Benalla North, a couple of hours north of Melbourne, small town, which has got a lot going on and creating a lot of jobs in that small town, so prices are growing there. And then some of those hill change places north of Melbourne, within commuting distance of the capital city, like Broadford, Beveridge, others like Kyneton, Seymour. Lots of demand coming into those hill change towns out of Melbourne in particular. So plenty of growth happening in regional Victoria. And turning to the capital cities, Hobart's the one that really stands out. For the last, say, 2 years, it's been the hottest capital city market, still the strongest, although, again, it feels to us like it's past its peak, still showing growth. I think what's important about Hobart is understanding why it's had what I would call a mini boom in the last couple of years, because Hobart hasn't done much for about 10 years. And it's all because real estate markets arise out of what's happening in the local economy. It's not so much about national factors. The level of interest rates being low is helpful, but it's not the thing that drives local property markets. It's really about the local economy, the level of infrastructure spending. Is the population growing? Are jobs being created? Now, for a long time, Tasmania didn't tick many of those boxes, but a lot has changed in the last, say, 5 years. Tasmania has risen up the economic rankings. For the last couple of years, it's ranked number 4 according to CommSec in its State of the States report that it publishes every quarter. That's a very high ranking for Tasmania, which traditionally has been 7th or 8th, i.e. last in the economic rankings amongst the states and territories, but it's consistently been 4th, ahead of Queensland and Western Australia and South Australia for the last say 2 to 3 years, spending a lot more on infrastructure. And so what we've found is that the Hobart market has risen. Homes are still selling faster there than anywhere else in capital city Australia. It's still got the lowest vacancies amongst the capital cities by far. It's got very good rental yields. And in the last 12 months and into 2019, it's the only capital city that's continued to have strong median price growth. It used to be the cheapest capital city in Australia, but no more because of the growth it's had in the last couple of years. Hobart's median house price has now overtaken those for Perth, Adelaide and Darwin. So it's been quite a growth centre, and we're not hearing a lot about it because media tends to obsess over the two biggest cities. They're down, so they're telling us the whole nation is. Well, Hobart certainly hasn't. And what's happened in Hobart has spread out to Launceston, the second city of Tasmania. It's still an incredibly strong market right now, and mainland buyers have been looking at and seeing the level of affordability, buying in suburbs with median prices in the 200,000s and 300,000s. Very good buying, high rental yields. So Launceston is still pumping, and so are some of the other regional towns around Tasmania. So the big question, I guess, for property investors is where next? Where next can we find growth amongst the capital cities? Where's the next boom city? So the first possibility, I'll put some teaser questions there on the screen. Which city has the number 3 ranked economy in the nation, the highest wages, the lowest unemployment, consistently low vacancies, the best rental growth in the nation for the last 12 months, and forecast by some that the highest price growth over the next 3 years? And the answer to that question is Canberra, the national capital, which I regard as the strongest real estate economy in the nation. And by that, I mean all the important stuff that underpins property markets, the economy that underpins property markets. The ACT is consistently ranked 3rd behind Victoria and New South Wales amongst the state and territories in terms of its economic strength. That's in the CommSec State of the States report. Forever, the highest average wages have been coming out of the ACT. Unnatural advantage, of course, being the capital city with lots of well-paid public servants, and because of that, also consistently the lowest unemployment in the land, and the vacancies are very low. So there's no hint of oversupply in that market. So the rental growth's been very good, and it's been producing steady price growth as well. It's really interesting to look at Canberra as a case study because it shows a number of important things that I think investors really need to know about. Constantly we have in our mainstream media economists being quoted about real estate issues. I don't know why they quote economists, because they're not experts on real estate. It's kind of like you've got the AFL Grand Final in Melbourne and you're calling in a hockey expert to give commentary during the AFL Grand Final. You wouldn't do it because hockey specialists aren't AFL experts. Well, it's just the same scenario when they're quoting economists about residential real estate. Most of them don't get it, and they talk about Australia as a single market, which is a clue that they don't know what they're talking about, because we don't have a single market in Australia. We have all these many diverse different scenarios playing out across the country, all of them driven by local economies. And to illustrate that point, you can compare Sydney and Canberra and see that over the last 10 or 15 years, they're very seldom, in terms of their property markets, been doing the same thing at the same time. Sydney's been down when Canberra's been up. Sydney's been steady while Canberra's been really strong. Sydney's been up strongly where Canberra's only up moderately. And right now, over the last, say, 2 years, where Sydney's been trending down, Canberra's still been chugging along, producing pretty good growth. In 2017, it was up 8 or 9%. Last year, it was up 3 or 4%. It's still doing that. It's just keeping on, as Canberra always seems to do, in contrast to the trend in Sydney, just 2 or 3 hours down the road. Just to illustrate some of the underlying characteristics of the Canberra market, the things that are important that drive real estate markets, the underlying economy. In population growth terms, the ACT is joint #1 in Australia, joint with Victoria. So population growing there well above the national average. In terms of unemployment, the ACT is, as it always is, well below the other states and territories and the national average. Very low unemployment. And as I said, it's got an unnatural advantage, being the the national capital. Vacancy rates, the latest figures on the screen there, the figures on the left-hand side of the screen. Hobart still got the tightest vacancies, but Canberra still also very low, below 1%, compared to Sydney, which is above 3% now, and well below the national average. All these things obviously help the property market. And if you look at it long term, according to figures published by CoreLogic, over the last 20 years, Canberra's growth in that time has exceeded Sydney. So that would surprise a lot of people. I think people perhaps have short memories. They forget that before the recent boom in Sydney had 10 years when it didn't show much growth at all, because Canberra is a place that just keeps on keeping on. I often refer to it as the Goldilocks of Australian real estate. Not too hot, not too cold, just right. Never seems to absolutely boom, but it never slumps either. It just keeps on keeping on. And over time, it's grown more over the past 20 years than Sydney has, and well above the national average. So all these things are useful to know if you're thinking about where next to invest in real estate. Now, there's lots of good places within the ACT, particularly up in the northern suburbs, I think up around Belconnen and Gungahlin, those markets that are actually going to benefit the most from the new light rail service that's recently been completed. But in terms of Canberra, I think the Queanbeyan market is the one that I would most recommend to property investors. Now, might seem a little bit strange for those of you who know that Queanbeyan isn't actually in the ACT, it's in New South Wales, but that's a mere technicality. There's a little invisible line drawn on a map that says that Queanbeyan's in New South Wales, but in actual fact, it's effectively part of the Canberra metropolitan area. But it benefits from having a foot in both camps because you can access incentives and assistance measures for first home buyers in New South Wales by buying in this market, but effectively being part of the Canberra metro area. So a lot of first home buyers are doing that, skipping across the invisible border and going down to Queanbeyan, accessing grants and stamp duty concessions available in New South Wales, and also finding that the real estate's a little bit cheaper down there than in most suburbs of Canberra. Vacancies are low, the population growth of that area is strong, yields are pretty good, 4.5% to 5.5%, and many of those suburbs are showing pretty solid growth at the moment, 7, 8, 9%. Crestwood is 25%, but I think that's a little bit misleading because that's a new development area, lots of new estates, and the new products at higher price than the older product, and it's perhaps artificially inflating the median price there. But nevertheless, there is good growth happening there, and I expect it to continue because of this big spending happening on infrastructure and new development there, and it's just a growth centre benefiting from its proximity to Canberra, and also by the fact that it's effectively part of regional New South Wales. So that's a market I would certainly think is worth having a look at if you're interested in the growth being generated out of Canberra. Okay, the second option to answer the question where next, what will be the next boom city or the next city where we're going to get some decent growth in capital city Australia. And the teaser questions for this location is which city is rising up the economic rankings, has below average unemployment, has growing business confidence, and got some really big events coming up in its economy, and it's forecast by some analysts at least to have the highest economic growth anywhere in Australia for 2019. And that city, surprisingly for some, is Adelaide, which I think is the most underrated capital city in Australia. It's got a lot of prospects, and I think that when Australia wakes up to what's happening in Adelaide, what's coming up there in its economy, and also the fantastic value for money that its real estate offers, Adelaide's going to have a boom. And it's already doing pretty well, because when we do it suburb by suburb, that analysis we do every quarter, we find that 3/4 of the suburbs of Adelaide have median prices higher than 12 months ago, and some pockets are rising, so 10%, 15%. It's a question of finding the growth markets within this growth city. Now, the things that we're excited about with Adelaide, firstly, it's the naval contracts. There's contracts being handed out to build submarines and other vessels for the Australian Navy, $89 billion worth of work over 10 or 15 years, and it's all happening, pretty much all happening at Port Adelaide in the South Australian capital. They're already building the extensions to the shipbuilding facilities right now to make that happen. That's $500 million investment just there, and then the vessels will start to be built, and it's going to create enormous jobs and economic activity in the city of Adelaide. The other thing that I like about Adelaide is it's become this kind of the Silicon Valley of Australia. It's the high-tech innovation capital of the country, undoubtedly. For example, it's the national leader on alternative energy, wind farms, solar farms, that kind of renewable energy. There's more of that action happening in Adelaide than anywhere else, or in South Australia rather than anywhere else in Australia. But it goes beyond that. We're seeing increasingly very big name companies, national companies and international companies moving their headquarters for Australia to Adelaide, because that's the happening place for the sort of high-tech innovation space that they're in. Elon Musk, with his Tesla battery business, he set up his Australian base in Adelaide for that reason. Technicolor, which has been involved in the movie industry for many decades. I'm sure many people are familiar with that iconic name, Technicolor. It's moved its Australian headquarters to Adelaide, and that's the place that there's all this innovation. The new Australian Space Station headquarters is being established in the CBD of Adelaide. So keep an eye on that, because it's really starting to generate some momentum for this city. It's starting to be known internationally for that, and it's creating jobs, and out of that will come growth in the real estate market, which is already pretty solid anyway. Now, within the city of Adelaide, there's lots of different precincts that I like, but the one that I like the most is called the City of Marion. That's the local government area, middle ring area, south and south west of the CBD of Adelaide. What I like about it is, firstly, it's got a lot of wonderful infrastructure that's likely to generate demand for real estate. It's the cluster of Flinders University, one of the biggest universities in the city, the Flinders Medical Precinct, big hospital facility, and then you've got the Tonsley Precinct. Tonsley was where the Mitsubishi car plant was manufacturing cars, but some years ago that closed down, which is indicative of the transition of Adelaide's economy from that old sort of manufacturing base to this new high technology type industry that's making the place thrive. So that Tonsley precinct's been repurposed as a high-tech innovation centre, and lots of interesting things happening there, including a project to create the driverless bus. I saw it when I was there a few months ago at the Tonsley precinct. The driverless bus was drifting around the streets of Tonsley, not crashing into anything as far as I can tell. So that project seems to be going well. Great road and rail links down there, Southern Expressway, rail links to the city, big shopping centres, very affordable real estate. Most suburbs in that precinct have median prices in the 400,000s and the 500,000s. Vacancies are very, very low, below 1%. Rental yields are good. And many of the suburbs in that precinct have had substantial growth in their median prices in the last 12 months, 8%, 9%. Edwardstown is up 13%. And there's lots of money being spent on property development and infrastructure in that area. So I just think it just ticks all the boxes for me personally. That's where I'm looking next for myself. I've just recently settled an investment property purchase in regional Victoria, and having got that one sort of settled down and tucked away, I'm now going to be focused on buying in Adelaide, because that's what I think is the location that excites me the most in terms of its growth potential as well as its affordability. And the City of Marion is where I'm going to first be looking. There are other parts of Adelaide I think are worth recommending. The Port Adelaide precinct, where the naval contracts, the vessels are being built. There's other things happening up there, lots of quality real estate at affordable prices. There are also the northern suburbs in the local government areas of Playford and Salisbury, big jobs nodes up in the north, and a lot of people like to live close to where they work. And the suburbs up there with median prices in the 200,000, some of them are below 200,000. It's the cheapest real estate anywhere in capital city Australia, with really good rental yields as well. Some of them are a bit stigmatised as being very down market, naturally, I guess, but I think worth having a look if you can get over that particular psychological hump and have a look around. Lots of good prospects in Adelaide to buy well, with prospects of great growth going forward once Australia discovers Adelaide the way that I have. Okay, the third possibility, answering the question where next. So this city has got an improving economy, is being strongly favoured by the population trends, is lifting infrastructure spending. We've seen the state budget this week announced big infrastructure spending, and 12 months ago the state budget here did the same thing. There's many tens of billions of dollars to be spent, vacancies have come down, things are starting to look very good, and of course I'm talking about Brisbane. Recently I wrote a column in which I characterised the Brisbane property market as like a car that's sort of revving furiously but can't take off because the handbrake's on. And I think that's been the way the Brisbane market's been for the last few years. It hasn't had the boom that Sydney and Melbourne had because it hasn't had the intrinsic growth drivers. Both Sydney and Melbourne took off because population growth was really strong, the underlying economies were the strongest in the country, and the infrastructure spend was huge. Sydney, they've just been spending tens and tens of billions of dollars on new rail links and new motorways, hospitals and universities, and it really has generated a strong economy, and out of that's come the property boom. Brisbane hasn't had that, but it's starting to trend in the right direction in terms of the Queensland now is the #1 state for interstate migration gains, and most of that, 90% of it's going to southeast Queensland, based around Brisbane. The infrastructure spend is lifting, the economy is improving, jobs are being created. The affordability comparison that Brisbane presents compared to Sydney and Melbourne is quite impressive. The rental yields are better, lots of opportunities, and right now there are specific precincts within Brisbane where prices are already growing. Our suburb by suburb analysis shows that 70% of the suburbs of Brisbane have median prices higher than 12 months ago. And that's really contrary to what you'll be reading in the media about Brisbane. You'll be reading figures saying Brisbane house prices have risen just 1% or have dropped 2%, depending on whose figures are being published. Well, when you look behind the figures and you do it suburb by suburb, precinct by precinct, you find there's some really strong markets in Brisbane that are already rising. And I think that's going to continue as we move forward. The economy, as I say, is improving. The resources sector is recovering strongly, and there's going to be growth to be found in this very affordable city as we go forward. I particularly like the Moreton Bay region up in the northern suburbs of Brisbane. Brisbane's kind of unusual amongst the capital cities of Australia. Most of the capital cities have dozens and dozens of local government areas, different council areas, whereas Brisbane only has 5. And Moreton Bay region encompasses a big chunk of northern Brisbane. It includes the Redcliffe Peninsula, places like Deception Bay, Caboolture, Morayfield, further south to places like Launton and Petrie. Most of the suburbs in the Moreton Bay region have median house prices in the 300,000s and the 400,000s. Very solid real estate. Some of them perhaps a little bit down market. Most of them are just solid, suburbs with affordable real estate. There's plenty of infrastructure in place. There's more coming up, like a new university campus, which is now under construction. New rail links to the Redcliffe Peninsula have recently been established. Lots of jobs nodes quite close, including the Australian Trade Coast precinct around the Brisbane Airport and the Seaport. This precinct has very low vacancy rates, good rental yields, and you can see on the screen some examples of the suburbs there and how much their median prices have grown in the last 12 months. You can see that this is an outperformer compared to those figures, those generalised figures published for Brisbane saying prices are up 1% or down 2% or haven't moved 0% in the last 12 months. Well, many of the suburbs in this precinct have done so much better than that, up 9%, 8%, Strathpine 10%, Burpengary East is up 11%. and there's big infrastructure spending happening. There's a big business park, $2 billion project happening, and the university campus and the Petrie area is underway, and that's going to bring a lot of rental demand to that precinct as well. Now, a lot of investors are looking for more than passive investment. They don't just want to buy an existing house and put in a tenant and wait for it to grow in value. They want something where they can do a bit extra, like perhaps a small subdivision, build a second dwelling or a granny flat, or eventually knock down the house and have the right under the zoning to build 5 or 6 townhouses, for example. This precinct has those sorts of opportunities. One example is the suburb of Deception Bay, which, as the name suggests, is waterside, a little bit down market, but gradually improving, and median prices in the 300,000s. And if you get the right property there, the land size and the zoning allows you to knock down the existing house and build 3 or 4 or 5 or whatever townhouses, for example. So those opportunities exist in suburbs like Deception Bay. Righto, so finally, in discussing the capital cities, possibility number 4, the next growth city amongst the capital cities. Which one are we talking about here? It's moving into a recovery mode, showing economic growth again, creating jobs again, reduced vacancies. Everything seems to be picking up there, even though the media is not really acknowledging it, because journalists don't necessarily know what they're talking about, and they're quoting economists who know even less. So this is Perth. Perth is actually undoubtedly, in my view, in a recovery mode. The recovery has been a little bit stalled by the election, which put a brake on things in Perth as well as everywhere else. But now that that's out of the way, I think the recovery in Perth can get fired up again. We've certainly seen vacancies come down a lot, and we're now starting to see rents rising again. And that's often a precursor to prices rising. We saw that in Sydney, in fact. Before the Sydney price boom started around 2013, we had a couple of years in which rents had risen a lot, but prices hadn't. And that was a signal, I think, that prices were about to do something in Sydney. So we're starting to see rents growing again in Perth because vacancies have dropped a lot in the last 1 to 2 years. Sales activity has also picked up, and there are some sections of the Perth market where prices have grown, particularly the top end, which is quite normal when a market's starting to move into a growth phase. Often it's the $1 million suburbs that move first. That makes sense, and certainly some of those better suburbs or more expensive suburbs in Perth. And Perth's got some wonderful real estate areas that front the beach or front the Swan River, close to the city centre. Great real estate credentials. Some of those have shown pretty good growth in the last 12 months. And across the Perth metropolitan area, 40% of suburbs have median prices higher than they were 12 months ago. So I don't have any doubt that the recovery is happening. But if you believe the media with its single figure, simplistic analysis telling us that Perth prices are still falling, you're not going to be aware that there's something quite different happening in the West Australian capital. So there's lots of different precincts that we could talk about, but the one that really stands out for me is the city of Joondalup, which is a local government area in the northern suburbs. It's got this wonderful CBD. It's the CBD for the northern precincts of Perth. And within that CBD, picture on the screen there of central Joondalup, it's got major university campus, TAFE campus, big hospital, major shopping, big transport hub, and all the government services are all there in this one clustered area. The Joondalup CBD, and around that are clustered suburbs like Edgewater and lots of others, Mullaloo, lots of good suburbs with solid housing with median prices in the 400,000s, 500,000, some a little bit more expensive. And if you go to the City of Joondalup website and you put a bit of a search, you can find some zoning maps which tell the areas that have particular zonings which allow you to do some value adding. Particular zonings, I think the R40 zone is one of them, where it's a house on a block of land of a certain size. you have the entitlement to subdivide and create a second dwelling. In some cases, you can create 2 extra dwellings if the block of land has the right zoning and is of sufficient size. It doesn't have to be enormous. Maybe 800 square metres is enough in some cases, but there certainly are opportunities in some of those suburbs in and around Joondalup to buy those properties where you've got a solid house which you can rent out in the short term, and longer term you've got the ability to build a second dwelling, perhaps do a small subdivision on that land and create a second block with a second house relatively cheaply. So Joondalup, lots of prospects. It was very resistant to the downturn, more so than most parts of Perth market, and now it's one of the leaders of the recovery that's now underway, I believe, in the city of Perth. Righto, so that's the prospects for capital city Australia. Some of the smaller cities, Brisbane, Adelaide, Canberra and Perth, all have prospects too that are worthy of consideration. But as I said earlier, most of the strongest markets right now in regional Australia, there's lots that I could talk about, but I'm just going to throw up a couple of examples in the time that's available. Sunshine Coast is a real standout, and sometimes I'm accused of being just a little bit biased because I live in the hills above the Sunshine Coast, looking down on the coast. And but I can tell you that perhaps 5 years ago, the Sunshine Coast was included in our no-go zones report because essentially it was a small tourism resort with a fragile economy and an oversupply, and prices were falling. A lot has changed. It's an amazing evolution economy. $20 billion of infrastructure spending that has happened, is happening, and will happen, is transforming this economy into a diversified, strong regional city. It's one of the most amazing real estate stories, I think, anywhere in Australia. The $2 billion university hospital is now completed and up and running. A whole lot of other things have sprung up around that. A private hospital is one, lots of specialist medical facilities, a hotel beside it. It's a $5 billion medical precinct that didn't exist. It's a whole new industry for the Sunshine Coast. At the same time, the airport, the Sunshine Coast Airport, which is already substantial, is being expanded with spending of about $400 million, and it's going to be converted into an international airport when it's finished. That's significant. There's $1 billion right now being spent on the motorway. That's well underway. The image on the screen is what the new Maroochydore CBD will look like in years to come. It's a 20-year project. Used to be a golf course right in the centre of Maroochydore, which is the most central suburb on the Sunshine Coast coastal strip. The golf course has been relocated, and 50 hectares of land is being repurposed. They're going to be building. It's already underway, but we're going to see office buildings, residential, retail, shopping centres, hotels, water features, and there's going to be a stop on the proposed new Sunshine Coast light rail project. So it's just really happening big time in terms of infrastructure, and it's really bringing in lots of new people to the Sunshine Coast. That new hospital precinct is bringing a lot of new people to come and live and work on the Sunshine Coast, many of them highly paid, and that's really boosted the Sunshine Coast property market. You can see on the screen the median price growth in some of the suburbs of the Sunshine Coast, particularly at the top end. Now, Noosa, most of you will have heard of. It's an iconic sort of holiday destination, a beautiful part of the world, lovely beaches and outlooks. The Noosa market, in fact, for 10 years did very little, but in the last year or so, it's really taken off because of what's happening in the Sunshine Coast economy. It's the top end of the market. So suburbs like Noosa, Tewantin, Noosaville, and nearby suburbs like Sunshine Beach and Sunrise Beach have all had big increases in their median prices, both for houses and apartments. Sunshine Beach, which is the most expensive suburb on the Sunshine Coast, its median price is up 37%. Noosa units are up 26%, and this is massive growth by anyone's standard. We're not hearing about it in mainstream media. We're hearing about prices falling everywhere. Well, they haven't discovered the Sunshine Coast yet, the people who are writing those articles, because you can see on the screen the sort of growth that's happening in the last 12 months and is still happening on the Sunshine Coast. And I believe that this story is only really just beginning. There's a lot more coming up in this market. But it's a great example of the opportunities in regional Australia. There's plenty of other examples I could talk about. We just don't have time to go across all of them. But another one that's coming up is Townsville in North Queensland. It's been through some tough times economically, but it's still solid. It's got a lot of diversity to its economy. It's got a big military economy, big education economy, manufacturing. It's strongly linked to the resources sector. A lot of the big projects in mining have their headquarters in Townsville. What you can see on the screen there is the new footy stadium, which is well under construction. It's part of the this picture, $25 billion plus in infrastructure spending happening or proposed to happen in Townsville. There's just so many different projects: expansion of the airport, expansion of the seaport, highway upgrades, spending on the military economy. The university keeps expanding. We've got the new footy stadium, lots of other things happening, and it's going to create over 10,000 jobs. If it all happens, it doesn't all need to happen for it to be a revolution for Townsville. Even if just a third of it happens, it's huge for a city of that size. And I think that we're going to see some significant price rises in coming years in Townsville. And the buying there is good right now because for the last few years, prices have been going backwards. But Clive Palmer debacle with the nickel business there has got a lot of publicity a couple of years ago. That didn't help. It's linked into the resources sector, which has been down for a few years, but it's now coming back strongly. There was an announcement today that the Adani coal mining project has got approvals to go ahead. That's headquartered out of Townsville, so there'll be jobs for Townsville out of that, if the news that we heard today is correct. So lots of positive headlines starting to emerge. With Townsville recently had a setback with some major flooding there, but rather ironically, that event is actually precipitating a mini economic boom because the recovery process results in a lot of investment by various levels of government, and so Townsville, I think, is very much on the way back. It's just another one of those regional centres, well placed for investors with an eye to the future. Now there are.
How will the Adani mine affect Townsville?
Well, it will affect it a lot because, as I mentioned, the headquarters for that project is in Townsville. So they're going to have a lot of. They already have a lot of people on the ground there, but now that they appear to have the approvals, they need to go ahead and actually start building it. There's more people going to be coming into Townsville, and it's all going to emanate from there. Even though the mine isn't on the doorstep of Townsville, but it's headquartered there. It's a logical place for a number of these big resources enterprises to have their headquarters because it's got an international airport and it's also got a major export seaport and lots of government infrastructure there. It's the government capital for North Queensland, and so there's a lot of reasons why Townsville gets a lot of spin-off from the resources sector projects like Adani. So there are many other regional centres around Australia that I could talk about if there was more time. Regional Victoria, places like Bendigo and Ballarat, very, very strong markets. Across regional New South Wales, you've got Dubbo, Orange, Wagga Wagga, Queanbeyan I mentioned earlier. Tamworth is coming strong. Newcastle's been very strong for a couple of years. The Hunter region is still rising. Byron Bay market's been very strong. There's lots of examples, and we're also seeing some growth starting to come into Western Australia and South Australia and the regional areas as well. So there are plenty of possibilities for people, and I think just to summarise the key points, it's very important to keep in mind we don't have one market in Australia. The economists keep talking about Australia as a single market. That's because they don't understand the subject terribly well. We've got all these different scenarios playing out, and that's normal in Australia. It's not normal for Australia to all be doing one thing. We never have a national property boom in Australia. Sydney's had a boom, Melbourne's had a boom, but lots of parts of Australia haven't. And as they subside, other parts of the nation are rising in terms of real estate. And it's all driven by local economic events. And just remember that catchphrase when you're looking for the prospects for growth in the future: think small for big growth. The smaller capital cities and some of the better regional centres. And keep in mind also that the real estate landscape has changed hugely in the last 2 or 3 weeks. The whole aura of sentiment around real estate has changed. People are out there doing things. Developers are reactivating their projects. Real estate agents and buyers agents are reporting massive increases in inquiry. Comparison websites like Finder reported to an exponential rise in inquiry and activity on their sites. People interested in real estate again because of the election result and the APRA announcement and the interest rate cuts. So good time to be considering it and looking. Tyron, are you probably picking up on the increase in optimism with your business as well?
Definitely. More the media. I've never seen a bigger shift in media sentiment than last 30 years. For the last 4 weeks, it's been amazing. And you're a journalist, so you would have clearly picked it up as well. It's been quite phenomenal.
Yeah, the turnaround's been extraordinary. Media tends to obsess over stories. That the boom was a big story, then the downturn was the story. Now I think they're going to start obsessing over the weaknesses in the economy. That's going to be the new obsession. But they've stopped writing those incredibly negative stories about real estate, and they've turned very positive. Just in like somebody flicked a switch. Remarkable turnaround.
No one likes a story saying there's going to be a clear, flat 5% growth. It's very boring. It's either boom or bust. My 30 years of looking at stories, it's a pretty boring story saying it's a clear 5% growth for the next 10 years. Just doesn't sell.
And it's got worse recently, Tyron, because it's all about clickbait now. They want people to click on things. And quite often what we find, because we research media every day, right around the country, seeing what's being said and seeing if there's any announcements that are of note for the research that we do, we quite often find that the headline bears no relationship to the actual content of the story. The headline's just designed to make you click on that story, and that's what it's all about, clickbait. And quite often the headline's quite dishonest, but it's very negative, very sensationalist, and that's misleading people as to what's really going on in real estate around the country.
Has there been an uptick in auction rates lately? Or?
Yeah, well, that's what we're seeing from the figures that are coming out over, say, the last. There was already some momentum building, some change happening even before the election, but particularly since the election, we've seen an increase in clearance rates in Sydney and Melbourne. So that's another indicator that things are improving. Another one is I'm very cynical about the publication of weekly changes in prices that CoreLogic likes to do, but nevertheless, their figures week by week, month by month show that the rate of decline of median prices in Sydney and Melbourne is getting smaller and smaller. And the most recent week, what they're reporting is that there's been no change. So if that's correct, and we await further information to see whether that's a trend, it does indicate that prices are now starting to stop their decline in Sydney and Melbourne. That's being reflected in the improved auction clearance rates. And yeah, just people on the ground at the coalface, Tyron, like buyers agents, are reporting, a big uptick in inquiry and activity since the election.
It makes sense. It makes sense.
It does make sense, yeah.
So have you got an offer for my clients? Yeah.
I do, actually. Funny you should mention that, Tyron. I just happen to have one here. In fact, it's the end of the financial year.
One you prepared earlier?
Yes, one I prepared earlier. Yeah, it's June, so we always have end of financial year offers, and it's a good time for people to be spending a bit of money to save on their tax, perhaps, but also planning for the next financial year. Premium membership is where, if you're a premium member, You get all of our hotspots reports, the top 5 hotspots reports, the top 10s, the price predict index, which we publish quarterly, the Ryder report we publish every couple of months. All of those reports are included, and this end of financial year special offer reduces the annual fee by $660. So it's a lot more affordable if you do it in the month of June, and you get a lot. On average, you'll be getting something from us in the form of a report with great information about where markets are primed for growth. You'll be getting a report roughly once a week, so a flow of information for people who are serious investors and want to know what's really going on, as opposed to what media is telling us. The other special offer is for the strategy sessions. I do one-on-one, 1 hour strategy sessions with people who want to sort of bounce their ideas off me or get some guidance in what direction they should be taking. We do it sort of via Zoom or Skype, Zoom or Skype rather, and that's also at a reduced price for the month of June. And at the end of the session, we include a couple of location reports. So whatever the discussion reveals is the areas of most interest to the customer in that strategy session, we'll send them the relevant location reports, which 2 location reports, that's $110 worth of extra value that you get in the special offer for the end of financial year. And if you want to take up it or inquire more or take up one of those special offers, you can go to the Hotspotting website, or you can contact me at ryder@hotspotting.com.au, and I can hopefully answer your questions and point you in the right direction to take up those special offers.
Should they mention this webinar, or how will they do that?
Yes, if they want to contact me and tell me that they tuned into the webinar and were interested in following up on that, please do that.
Cool. Thank you. Okay, so we've got a couple of questions here, Terry. You've got a couple of minutes more. So if can you go to the next slide, or do I need, if you just go to the next slide? I've obviously got a offer for our database. It wouldn't be me if I didn't talk about depreciation for like 1 minute. So if any one of you that have stuck around and want to order a report before June 30, we've got a special price as a thank you for coming this far. It's $600 GST inclusive, which is pretty good. But also the first 20 will get a copy of my new book, which is Secrets of Property Millionaires Exposed. If you can go to the next slide there, Terry. There you go. There's me at the top right. And I will even sign it and send it to you. I don't know whether my signature adds value or not, but you will get a signed copy of my new book, Secrets of Property Millionaires Exposed. That's only for the first 20 people that order a report before June 30. So hopefully you can. Okay, a couple of questions, Terry. So one question here is, which suburbs in New South Wales would you recommend? From Mike. Thanks, Mike.
Suburbs in New South Wales, not specifically Sydney, but locations in New South Wales.
Just says New South Wales. Just says New South Wales.
Well, I did talk about Queanbeyan, but in context of being part of Canberra, effectively, but it's in New South Wales. But beyond that, I think Orange is looking really good at the moment. It's one of the, it ticks all the boxes for me. A regional city like Orange, it's substantial size. It's got a nice location. It's got diversity in its economy. It's part of a wine district, so it's got a lovely lifestyle element to it. It's got a component of the resources sector because there's a massive gold mine just outside of Orange. It's got a big government sector, education, agriculture, viticulture, and in the last 12 months, its median price has risen 10%. So it's just one of those markets in regional Australia that we're not hearing about, which is going really well. So Orange stands out. I think Tamworth is doing quite well. It's starting to rise. Dubbo is always very, very solid. Long term, I think Dubbo is one of those safe places that's never going to let you down. Very strategic, very diversified. And it's a bit of a roughie for New South Wales. One, I think it's got great potential. Parks. Now, most people perhaps know Parkes as the location for the satellite telescope that was featured in the movie The Dish.
That's the first thing that came to my mind.
Yeah. Well, it's also, it's a strong regional town for agriculture and a few other things, tourism. But the big kicker there is the Inland Rail Link is going to take it to another level. And they actually officially launched the Inland Rail Link earlier this year with a sod turning in Parkes, because Parkes is very central to the route. It's going to be one of the key stops on the Inland Rail Link, which is going to be a very, very important piece of multi-billion-dollar infrastructure, particularly for regional New South Wales, linking sort of from Victoria right up into Queensland. And Parkes is kind of the nerve centre of that project. So, right now the median price is something like 250,000, and the rental yields are 6 or 7%, and prices are chugging along all right. But that Inland Rail Link is going to take it to another level. So it's just one of those ones out of left field that people might want to consider.
Cool. Thanks. Okay. From Steve, where is the best place for a first-time buyer in Victoria? Budget 500K.
Okay, so what we're seeing in Victoria, and this is why I think one of the main reasons why regional Victoria is so strong at the moment, because first-time buyers for a few years have been buying in the outer ring areas of Melbourne, like up in the north around Epping, or down in the southwest around Wyndham, Vale and Werribee, and out west at Melton. But those, because of the price growth, those places have become relatively expensive now. So first-time buyers are actually moving beyond the borders of the Melbourne metropolitan area to some of these regional centres that are within commuting distance, because you've got the regional rail link providing good rail links into Melbourne. You've also got good road links, and you've also got to remember that not everyone works in the CBDs. There's massive jobs nodes up in the north of Melbourne. So you can buy in very affordably in some of these hill change towns, or in the bigger regional cities like Bendigo and Ballarat, and commute to jobs in the general direction of Melbourne. So that's a very strong possibility to consider. Looking a little bit outside of Melbourne and finding those places where you can buy good property in, say, the 300,000s, and commute to jobs. But keeping in mind that if you're in places like Ballarat and Bendigo, there's plenty of jobs there as well. These are growth cities. There's lots happening in these places. So there are good options to consider.
Cool. All right, final question from Amir. Which suburbs in Brisbane do you recommend?
Yeah, lots of good possibilities in Brisbane, particularly if you want to buy the affordable end of town. I talked in detail about the Moreton Bay region, which is up in the northern outer ring area. You've also got Ipswich City, which is the southwestern precinct of the Brisbane metropolitan area. Even more affordable in some cases there. Some suburbs with median prices in the 200,000s, but most in the 300,000s. Lots of jobs nodes out there. A lot of big industrial businesses go out there because there's great transport links, motorway and rail, and the land's much cheaper than closer into the centre of Brisbane. So there ought to be out there. As an example, last year the federal government announced a $5 billion contract to build vehicles for the Army, and Ipswich City is where the factory to build those $5 billion contract of vehicles is happening, close to what I call the Goodna precinct. It's a good place to look. Goodna is a suburb of lots of big old Queenslanders on 1,000 square metre blocks of land, and you can subdivide. So there's value adding possibilities there as well. But lots happening in Ipswich. Logan City is the land bridge between Brisbane and the Gold Coast, so it's very strategically located, very affordable again, great transport infrastructure, plenty of jobs nodes, lots going for it. So yeah, lots of good, strong possibilities right across the Brisbane metropolitan area.
And Ipswich has Ash Barty now that everyone want to live there because she's going to win Wimbledon soon.
Yeah, isn't she great? I think she's fantastic, Tyron.
I know you like her. She's unreal.
I'm so happy to see that success because she's there's no big ego. She's just worked hard and she deserves her success.
I think we should end on that. Absolutely, she's fantastic. So tomorrow we're going to email a copy of this webinar with the special price and the offer of 20 books for people that sign up. We'll also put Terry's details in there. I'm really stoked that you came, Terry, to have this talk. If you want to say something to the database before we go.
Yeah, look, I think one of the mistakes I think property investors make, Tyron, is that they kind of skimp on the little expenses, and then they go out and spend $500,000 on a piece of real estate. I think it's false economy not to spend a bit of money on good advice and good research, and also to get a decent depreciation report as well, to get the advice of professional companies like Washington Brown. Certainly there's something, what I notice about the people that I know who are customers of hotspotting, who have got big portfolios, been really successful, is they treat it like a business and they're prepared to spend money on good advice and good research. And I think that's the secret of their success. So I'd urge people to do that, and one way you can do that is take advantage of those special offers that I've put up there, and also your special offer as well, Tyron.
Just take independent advice, Terry. Take independent advice. It's not that hard. I don't think I've ever seen you. It's not that hard to have to research your own where you should buy. It's not that hard. I think people should spend more money on working out, paying people like yourself and researching the market than relying on other people. And you'd obviously agree with that.
I was talking to a friend the other day who's thinking of selling a property in Brisbane, probably sort of in the $700,000 category. And I suggested that to make sure she's setting a price right, she get an independent professional valuation. But she wasn't prepared to spend sort of, say, $500 to do that. And I thought, that's crazy. You're going to be getting 700 grand when you sell, but you're not prepared to spend 500,000 to make sure you're selling at the right price. It is crazy. But
I get it. I understand. I know it's funny. Funny, I will. Anyway, let's end on that note. I really appreciate your time. I hope my database does. I hope everyone that turned up does. I really appreciate you coming, Terry. Thanks. Thank you.
Yeah, no, my pleasure. Like I said earlier, the hard part when it comes to real estate is getting me to shut up. So I'm always happy to talk about
it. Good stuff. All right, everyone. Thanks for coming. We're going to end it here, and I hope you enjoyed it. I certainly did. So thank you, Terry, and thanks everyone for turning up. Good night.
Okay. See you later.